And again, this would not have been possible without the incredible folks that lead our board, including our next two speakers, the Reverend Al Sharpton and Governor Christie. But again, I just want to say thank you to all the employers, and particularly shout out to Michelle Sakurka, NJBIA, and all those employers who are willing to take a second chance. That's going to be the focus of next year's conference. But with that, God willing, I'd like to call upon Christie and Governor Christie and Al Sharpton. Let me just say these are two of my favorite human beings. When Jim McGreevey was a little toxic, a little radioactive, there was a governor who happened to be on the other side of the aisle, but a really good guy who believed in the importance of second chances, grappling with addiction, and understanding through his vast experience as a U.S. attorney, the importance of giving people a second chance. So on a human level, for giving me a second chance, and allowing me to sort of deliver within this ministry. And I also want to say he was always great with our budget. I'm also glad Steve Sweeney was always there too. It was a 1-2 punch. I think Steve had a much bigger punch, but somebody who's been tremendous in my life as a friend, as an advocate, the great Governor Christie. Governor, thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Gov. How are you?
Good to be with you. And also is Al Sharpton's running a little late, but he's going to be on. So could you just, before Al comes on, Chris, could you give us a little bit about you've spoken about the shame and the stigma of addiction. You were really in the reentry space, I would argue, long before most people. There certainly wasn't a lot of political upside. Could you share with us a little bit about your thinking about that space and how you got into it and why you got into it? And I know you and Mary Pat and Daytop, but it would be interesting to see your experience with the nonprofit at Daytop and your experience as a U.S. attorney, and how that came together in terms of your leadership and vision for reentry.
Sure. Thanks, Gov. Listen, it's rooted even before that. It's rooted in my pro-life position. My view is that every life is an individual gift from God, and that those lives are no less precious when they're sitting on the floor of a county lockup because of a drug addiction problem than they are when they're sitting in the womb of a mother. And so my approach on this is rooted in that sense that every life is a gift from God, every life is precious, every life has value. Well, if you believe that, it's easy to be pro-life when the child's in the womb. They've done nothing to disappoint you yet. When they come out and life's challenges face them, and some of those challenges overwhelm some of us from time to time, you need to be just as much pro-life then. And so that's what drove me as a 31-year-old county freeholder to Daytop Village, which was a adolescent inpatient drug treatment facility in Morris County, and helped to teach me so much. I learned so much from Father Joe Hennon, who ran that organization, about the process that government could play in trying to bring less stigma to this problem. And so I helped when I was a freeholder. When I left the freeholder board, I served on the board of Daytop. Mary Pat and I were both big contributors to them as well, with our private giving. And we cared deeply about the lives that they saved. And we watched them save lives that otherwise would have wound up either being completely ruined by addiction or would have wound up dying from the addiction. And so then when I was U.S. attorney, I got to see up close the people that I was duty bound by the law to put in jail. But my next question to my folks were, well, once they're in jail, are we just going to forget about them?
Yep.
Is it just a check mark on a ledger, and you move on from? And I felt there wasn't. And so we started to work on some of those issues when I was U.S. attorney. And then obviously, as you know, once you get the governor's seat in New Jersey, there is so much ability to do good that being able to work with you and others in this reentry space allowed me to marry all of those things, right? Take a smart approach on law enforcement because public safety is important, but also understand that these lives are precious and people who want a second chance deserve a second chance. And the last thing I'd say, Gov, is it's not always going to be successful. Some people will not succeed. Their second chance will turn into a third or fourth chance, and then maybe no chances left. But to me, that's never been an excuse for walking away from the one life you can save. And so, to me, when you look at what we've done in New Jersey, and I know we'll talk about this, we really were in the lead in the entire country in prison reform.
And you also, I'd also argue, Governor, that Chris, that you also understood the intersection between addiction and imprisonment. And it was pretty controversial at the time, when you actually mandated that people were moving them into drug court. I mean, there were people that, and some of them are people that we know and respect, that were like, this is a little edgy, but you were almost sort of driving them into treatment. Yes. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, because there were people, especially on your side of the aisle, who felt like, treatment can't be forced upon anyone. We have to wait for them to ask for it. And, my view always was that if we waited for an addict to admit their addiction, we're going to lose a lot of people in the interim. And sometimes they need to be placed there to be with people who are suffering from the same problem, to inspire them to see that there was a better way to go. And so, yes, we made drug court mandatory in our law. And I'll tell you who else didn't like it. Some people in law enforcement didn't like it.
Yeah.
They wanted to lock them up and throw away the key routine. And, I just didn't believe that was the way to go. Again, all of this is rooted in believing in my heart that everyone deserves a second chance, that every life is really precious. And there was real resistance to it, as you know, and resistance from places that I didn't necessarily expect at first. But that's where you just remain persistent politically, as you understand, and just say, tell me why this won't work. And the last part on the prison reform stuff, too, was establishing what I think was a first of its kind drug addiction prison, where folks can go there and get treatment.
Yep.
Part of their sentence, so that you're preparing them for success with their second chance, giving them medically assisted treatment before they leave prison, giving them the type of counseling they need in prison to get ready. Because you and I know that the most vulnerable moment for those folks is when they first get out of prison, when people are not giving them a second chance necessarily. And then they can fall back to old relationships, old habits that got them where they were in the first place. So you need to incorporate all these things for successful reentry. And just one of them by itself may work, but all of them together gives you such a geometrically improved chance of working. And by the way, for those like me who are fiscal conservatives, it saves money. Because what you pay to incarcerate someone is double what it costs per year for us to treat them. And then if these people, then become really functional, happy, productive human beings, then they become taxpayers. And it's hard for us to even calculate what that means. And they become responsible husbands or wives, responsible fathers and mothers, responsible sons and daughters. And what that adds to our social fabric is incalculable.
So two questions, and Reverend Al's coming on in 2 minutes, but MAT was a hard thing, I know, for a lot of us. The idea, and you can look at New England Journal of Medicine and the British Journal of Nature, and you see how Vivitrol and Suboxone were so successful. But it was hard to move into that space. I would argue nationally, you were one of the first governors, be it Democratic or Republican, and to move into MAT. Can you just talk about that decision? And I will tell you that, as you said, diversion, treatment, but MAT has been so important. We now have, Governor Chris, over 1,000 of our program participants on MAT every single day. That's keeping largely these young guys and gals alive. How did you get to that place, relatively quickly?
Well, Gov, we had a lot of these folks who are right now in today's atmosphere, which is why we're virtual and not in person because of COVID-19. You hear now all the time the mantra, follow the science, right? And it's become almost a political mantra, right? Follow the science. Well, hell, that's what I did regarding MAT, because the science is very clear on this, that those people who are given the chance at medically assisted treatment are significantly more successful in remaining on the right path towards recovery and reentry. Now, that doesn't demean the normal counseling that we give as part of and the other things we do, but listen, these opiates, whether it's heroin or fentanyl or any of the prescription opiates, Percocet, Oxycontin, these are extraordinarily powerful drugs, mind-altering drugs. And I think that there's been too much of a sense in our society that, well, they should just be able to go cold turkey and, if they had some discipline, they would be able to handle it. That's not the case for many people, if not most. And so, to me, the way I moved towards it was I followed the science. And the science tells us that this may not be perfect for everyone, but giving people the opportunity at this, where appropriate, prescribed by a physician, is the right way to go. And you're right. I had a number of fellow governors around the country who, thought that I was, a little bit nuts for moving this way. But in the end, you see more and more of them now moving in that direction because the statistics are undeniable. And MAT, Vivitrol, Suboxone, whichever you use, whichever one is appropriate. And that's the last thing I'd say to you is we need to make it easier for doctors to be involved in this. Because this is we allow them to prescribe the Oxycontin.
Exactly. That's the great irony. You can prescribe Oxycontin, Percocet, but Suboxone or Vivitrol requires special training.
Special training. So we went at two fronts, as you know, in New Jersey. One, we now require people to get addiction training and training on those prescribing those addictive drugs. Is that required of our physicians in New Jersey? That was part of the law that we passed when I was governor. But by the same token, now we need help from the federal government. This is where the Biden administration could be really helpful. I think that kind of training should be a requirement of maintaining your DEA license. And we should be permitting more doctors to be able to prescribe MAT, whether it's Vivitrol or Suboxone, because the fact that you can't find a doctor who can give this to you is another deterrent from people getting on it and getting better.
So thank you. And with that, Reverend Al's with us, and I just like to call upon the great Reverend Al, who's our strategic partner. And one of the things that I not only is he a great preacher and a great friend, but I want the governor to know that during the height of the pandemic, we were out there, and thanks to the leadership of the National Election Network, feeding 5,000 reentry persons a day in the state of New Jersey, whether it was in Newark or Ocean County or Middlesex. And so I think he's with us now, the great Reverend Al Sharpton. Al, Rev? He's coming on. The one last question until he comes on, and I guess the technical guys deal with this. Chris, we still have a problem with young guys that are 22 or 23 years of age that somehow we can't get them into treatment because they don't want to listen and we don't have legal control over them. That's something that I'd love to see us be able to do. I think, ladies and gentlemen, Rev, you're with us.
I am.
Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
How's the audio?
I've waited a long time to have Christie have to wait for me.
Well, it is always the pleasure. Good to be with you again.
Good morning. How you doing, Governor?
Doing great. We're divided just by one nasty little river, Reverend Al. Otherwise, we're together.
Right. That's right.
Amen. So we were just talking, Rev, we were just talking a little bit, and before you came on, I just also want the audience to understand that what the National Action Network is, my dear friends, Reverend Bartley and Reverend Al, feeding 5,000 persons. every day during the height of the pandemic for literally about 100 days. I just wanted to say thank you to the National Action Network. I should also mention that Reverend Al, of the three of us, is the best dressed. But in any event, things don't change. So while I get, clearly two major thought leaders nationally, and one from the governmental perspective, Reverend Al from the theological and from the religious community, and Governor Christie. Chris was just sharing with us, his experience in addiction, his experience as a U.S. attorney working on some of these issues, and how he came to reentry. I mean, the other point, Chris, is that we always mention it costs $55,000 to keep somebody in a prison cell, but reentry is so much less. Why, Al? Why do you think we have this love affair with prisons? And why don't we help? We're willing to spend so much for the concrete wall, for the barbed wire, but we're not really fully engaged the way I would argue Governor Christie has and Governor Murphy has continued it. Why don't we as a nation, and somebody, Sheila Oliver and Cardinal Tobin talked about, why is America's incarceration levels so off the charts, and why can't we get out of this and move to a more rational, as Governor Christie said, process where whether it's addiction or housing or job training, we're providing those skills?
Well, I think it's driven by fear. I think that the public becomes afraid in all communities, I might say. And it's easier to try and lock away what you're afraid of rather than to do the more difficult work of trying to separate those that are redeemable and reformable, and put in the time and investment in trying to salvage people rather than just lock away my fears. I don't want to deal with it. And I'll give an example. In the 90s, we had a very well-known basketball star, Lynn Byers, died of crack cocaine. The reaction across the board was, we've got to come down on crack. That's where the 94 crime bill came from. And it was supported by most of the Congressional Black Caucus, most of the Black leadership. I was one of them that said, wait a minute, I think this is going too far. I was totally attacked by people in leadership in the Black community. And it became the thing that we ended up being right and incarcerated people for years. It was an overkill in many situations. And I'm raising that to say this isn't just a right-wing, left-wing thing. People are naturally inclined to give to their impulse of fear, and that leads to mass incarceration. So I think that we have to be able, as those of us that want to be thought leaders or influencers, to try to tell people that will not always be the just thing to do. And secondly, it is not salvageable for the community. If you have people doing 5, 10, 15 years for things that they could be redeemed, that's somebody's son, that's somebody's brother, that's somebody's father. We need to do that. And I think that's a bipartisan issue. Ed Koch, who was a former mayor of New York, and I used to fight the whole 12 years he was in, had me arrested at every march. But we came together and formed the Second Chance program and did it until he died. And I think this is the kind of thing that responsible people on both sides of the aisle can say, this is what is good for society.
Chris, Governor, do you see picking up what Reverend Al said, do you see it? And it's not really, I would argue that this is, during the Trump administration with the First Step Act, many people on both sides of the aisle saw that as positive. Is reentry or de-incarceration and moving people to the pipeline for job treatment, for addiction, for housing, is there an opportunity here on both sides of the aisle?
Well, sure, and the Trump administration showed that with the First Step Act. That was a bipartisan effort. We showed it here in New Jersey with what we did. Imagine the horror of the ACLU having to give me an A on that
was horrible for both of you,
right? The only A in the entire country in terms of prison reform, with the things we did. And what happened when we did prison reform smartly? Yep. The prison population has gone down significantly. We were able to close 2 state prisons, yep, while I was governor, but crime continued to go down. So what Reverend Al is saying is right, that, again, let's follow the facts of what's going on here, and then let's also follow our hearts about what we believe in terms of the value of human life. And so to me, those two things can bring the parties together. But let's be clear, two things about this. One, it won't bring everybody together. But no issue brings everybody together. We
Yep.
can't worry about having everyone on board. We need representatives of both sides, and we've shown both nationally and on the state basis here in New Jersey that you can bring significant numbers of those people together. Secondly, we can't overdo. Okay, we've got to be smart about how we do this. And so the truly violent criminals who are not showing, based upon their conduct, a willingness to reform when they're given that chance, well, we still have to make sure that we protect our society. But it should be, in my view, the presumption should be that everybody gets a second chance until they prove that they're not worthy of it. And there are going to be some people who are proven that way. So we need to continue to have prisons. We need to continue to have that ability to keep our society safe. But the presumption, in my view, should be in favor of giving people a second chance and giving them the tools they need to succeed that second chance. If their issue is addiction, we should be helping them with counseling and with MAT. If their issue is they need job training, and sometimes a combination of all these things, we need to be there for that, because second chances don't have value if you don't give people the tools they need to succeed. Then it's just a.
So, Chris, I mean, to go back to what Reverend Al said, I mean, when you look at nationally and New Jersey and a lot of the changes, and we're blessed in the state legislature, and Governor Murphy has continued in New Jersey, there was always a bipartisan consensus on addiction treatment. But when you look at the percentages of people in prison across this nation, they're overwhelmingly in state prisons. And whether it's the National Governors Association or the DGA or RGA, how do we move the country to adopt a more progressive stance? And I'm going to ask the same question of Reverend Al. How do we move the nation to replicate what New Jersey has done? Because, 2 million of our fellow citizens are in prison today.
Well, first of all, we need to show the success of what's happened here, because the boogeyman that will be used, of course, is that crime will go up. And in New Jersey, we've seen that's not been the case. That, in fact, crime has gone down during this time. So one you have to do is statistically, but that's not enough. You have to speak to people's hearts, Gov. You have to speak to their hearts. There is no one that I know who has not had someone that they care for or love affected by addiction. And you have to say to those folks, what do you want for them? And if what you want for them is recovery and a new chance at a productive, happy life, then why shouldn't that apply to everyone? Yeah. Why shouldn't everyone have that opportunity? And so to me, that's why I continue to say that this is rooted in my belief. Not everyone has to believe this, and not everyone does. But it's rooted in my Catholic faith and in my belief in that pro-life, that every life is a precious individual gift from God, and that every one of those lives needs to be treated with respect. And like I said before, and Reverend Al wasn't here at the time, but it's easy enough. I say this to my Republican friends all the time who oppose this. I go, sure, it's easy to be pro-life when the baby is in the womb, because when that life is in the womb, it's done nothing yet to disappoint you. But when that life comes into the world and faces the challenges that the world throws at us every day, and some of those challenges are much greater for some than others, depending upon where you were born and the opportunities you've been given by the destiny of zip code, that when that life is there, it's just as precious. It's just as precious when it's sitting on the floor of the county lockup, drug addicted at 16 years old and in jail for the third or fourth time. It's just as precious then. And so to me, part of the way we need to discuss this, and I'm sure that Reverend Al discusses it this way, not only in the great philanthropic and political work that he does, but from the pulpit as well.
Yep.
That every one of God's creatures is precious. And we need to think about it that way. And I think that part of the way to appeal to conservatives on this is to appeal through that type of conversation. Because you're going to be a hypocrite, Gov. If you say you're pro-life, but not for the lives that are that are existing on Earth right now, well then heck, what is the basis of your pro-life
But
position?
what you did is, and what's continued is putting money into addiction treatment, putting money into job training, putting money into whether it's motor vehicle identification. I mean, Rev, could you pick up on what the governor, and I think it's what you said, it's fear. But how do we, like, we're the highest incarceration rate in the country. And to go to Governor Christie's point, the conflation I know in New Jersey between addiction and incarceration is very high. It's about, I'd say 76 to 78% of our clients have, whether it's addiction, drugs, and or alcohol. About 44% have opioid. How do we move the national conversation, even on the First Step Act? I mean, the challenges in the negotiations in the Senate were difficult. How do we move this, as to do Governor Christie's point, as a moral cause, but also make sure that the resources follow? Because I don't think the criminal rate stays low by accident. It happens because people have access to housing, access to employment. How do we move this nationally? Right.
I think that you start with, I agree with Governor Christie, by showing the victories.
That's a dangerous clip for both of you. So.
Yeah, well,
we've lived that life before, both
right. That's true. We've been through that. But and I say this in the sense that people need to know that people can be redeemed and that these things do work. The kind of work that you're doing, Governor McGreevey, they need to know it can work. I think that the idea of appealing to the value, the human value of life is true. You cannot, I think he said it right. You can't love the child before he's born and then lock him up when he's born and throw the key away. I mean, that is an inconsistency and a contradiction that won't work. This is Good Friday that we're talking. And in the Christian faith, Easter Sunday morning, Jesus said to Peter upon his resurrection, "Go and feed my sheep." I mean, it is our job, those of us that claim to be faith leaders or those that claim to have any kind of moral compass, whether it's Jewish, whether it's Christian, whether it's Muslim or other, is that we value human life. Therefore, we should try at all costs to preserve the dignity of human life unless they are irredeemable by their own choice. And I agree with the case that's saying that, and I don't think that people on the left, where I'm usually on issues, don't expose a lot of the fact that we are not soft on people that do not decide that they don't want to be redeemed. They want to be violent. They want to be a menace to society. Then they ought to be dealt with accordingly, because they prey on our communities more than other communities. So we're not welcoming home people that want to be violent to grandma. The data shows that we are the victims as much as we are also the ones that are incarcerated. So there's no soft on crime here. I remember a friend of mine I ran into maybe 4 or 5 months ago in the height of the pandemic. And he said, "Man, I see you on TV a lot, Al." We grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn together. He said, I said, "Yeah, what happened to you?" He said, "Well, me and you used to argue about, you wanted to be a preacher, I wanted to be a thug. And, I got caught out there, and I'm just getting out of Rikers Island a year ago." I said, "Well, that's where thugs' address are, Rikers Island. That's where you wanted to be." And I think we've got to be able to say, I'm progressive, but I'm not cutting you a slack. If you want to be a thug, I'm not fighting for your right to be a thug. I'm fighting for your right to have a second chance if you don't want to be that. I'm fighting for you to be able to get out of your addiction. Nobody is fighting to glamorize gangsterism. It is gangsterism that is tearing our communities down. And I grew up, my father left when I was young. I grew up on welfare, on the food stamps, the whole bit. But my mother used to make me walk with her to the train every morning when she'd go downtown Manhattan to be a domestic worker, saying, "Life is about choices. You choose to rise up. You may not be responsible for being down now, but you're responsible for getting up." And that's what we've got to preach to people. And we've got to be able to have those values intersect with people that we may not be comfortable. Last point on that. when the governor Christie was referring to what happened under the Trump administration. Cory Booker called me and said, "Look, it may not be comfortable, but this First Step Act, I need you to support it. I know you and Trump can't stand the ground each other walk on, but Jared Kushner called me and said, can you get Sharpton to support this?" I said, I'll support it because it's a step in the right direction. And I did. And Van Jones and others did. They were criticized for it. I wouldn't go to the signing of the bill because I was not going to be photographed with Donald Trump, but I felt it was an important step. So sometimes if you're going to be real leaders, you got to step outside of your comfort zone to be about what you say you're about.
Amen. And I think, I mean, to go to what Governor Christie said earlier on addiction treatment in prison. So is there a possibility, to go to Reverend Al's point, Chris, that, you know, giving people an opportunity for a second chance, if we were to look at prisons now, and when I'm in prison, it's a lot of the time, Rev, that's spent idle, that's spent doing nothing. And thanks to the leadership of Governor Christie and the Senate President Steve Sweeney, you know, we're helping people get Medicaid cards, helping people get SNAP and GA behind the wall. But I almost think we need a revolution, Chris, to start job training, to make sure that when people are in behind the wall, they start that process. For so many of our guys and gals that are coming out, if they don't have an industry recognized credential, whether it's HVAC or CDL, they can't get that job. The only thing they can get is a warehouse job opportunity for 6 months, and then they'll be dropped off before the health insurance kicks off. If you were thinking about sort of second chances and employment opportunities, what would that look like behind the wall?
Well, let's start off with the premise that incarceration was also supposed to be about rehabilitation, right? That's part of the underlying premise, at least, of where we started with our system in this country. And so if we're going to live up to the words we use, then we have to have more extensive training for people while they're in prison. And let me say this, the federal system does this much better than the state systems. You know, my experience when I was U.S. attorney was there was significantly more opportunities in the federal prison system for people to get educational training, to be able to get job training, to be able to be prepared for when we went out. And so the model is there. It's not that the federal system is perfect, it's not, but it's significantly better in my experience than most of the state systems. And so, you know, people ask, why did I focus on this coming in as a Republican? It was because of the experience as the U.S. attorney in the federal system. That's why we also did things like getting rid of what essentially in New Jersey was debtor's prison.
Yep.
You know, when people on small crimes could not get out of jail, wound up serving more time pre-trial than they would have served if they just pled guilty on the first day because they didn't have $500 to post a 10% bail alternative. So one of the things we did, as you know, was put in a system that was essentially cashless bail for those type of offenses. Did I invent this? No, it's what the federal system does. And they have a bracelet to be followed in some instances. In some instances, for real low-level crimes, they just have to call into their pretrial officer to make sure they're going to show up for their trial stuff. So I think that the states need to look at the federal system, both in terms of the way we incarcerate people pretrial, which I believe should be restricted to only those people who have a record. But Gov, remember, you know this from being governor, in New Jersey, we had a constitutional amendment, a constitutional provision rather, that said that bail was presumed.
Yeah.
And that the only way a judge couldn't give bail is if the person was at risk of flight. Well, with most of these folks, they're not at risk of flight anyway. They go right back to the same neighborhood they were, and they continue to commit crimes. So that's part of the way we reach bipartisanship on this, is, yes, I made all of those changes. But what I said in return to my Democratic friends was, can we eliminate that provision and give judges the discretion to consider people's violent history in terms of deciding whether they should be released pre-trial or not? And we were able to find compromise on that. And so pre-trial prison, for instance, now is just for those people that Reverend Al was just talking about. the
Yep.
irredeemable ones at the moment who feel like they want to continue to command him or want to go out and intimidate the witnesses against them to be able to make sure that we can't have that occur. And Reverend Al is right about this. That happens much more frequently in neighborhoods of color.
Yep.
It happens in white neighborhoods. Just a fact. So the way to get to these places is to do exactly what Reverend Al was just talking about, which is to say, we stand up for a number of values. One, that every life is precious. Two, that every life is redeemable and deserves a second chance. But three, we also stand up for the fact that the lives on the outside are valuable as well. And for those who decide to use Reverend Al's word, they want to be a thug or they want to continue to be violent, well, then we have a place for them. And in New York City, it's called Rikers Island. And here it's our county prison system who can keep them detained pre-trial. But there is no question, Jim, that we have to invest the way the federal government has, and in some senses even greater, because our numbers are greater in each individual state, in making sure that we make their time in prison
Valuable.
productive, so that when they get out, they don't feel like a loser. They don't feel like somebody who can't succeed. They have an ability to be able to go out and get a job and to be able to work and to support themselves by doing good, honest work and not going back to a life of crime to support an addiction or to support themselves to feed themselves because they can't otherwise do it.
Rev, do you want to just talk about the job training portion that the governor just referred to?
I think that when I was growing up, they used to call it the Department of Correction.
Right.
Now they call it the House of Detention. I think we've got to get back to having the whole value system of the criminal justice, that part of the criminal justice system, geared toward correction and job development and job training while people are incarcerated or released into job training is critical, because you need to have people prepared for entering the mainstream employment world with that kind of training. What inhibits a lot of that? One, people are mindful of the fact they don't have any skills. Rather than say that, they try to create some facade that compensates for the fact that they can't just come out and say, I want to work, but I don't know what to do. I don't have the skills. So you can use this as an opportunity to remove that insecurity and remove that shame and give them skills. They come in many cases out of areas that skilled apprenticeship was not available to them. I think that we should not just assume that we could let somebody out of jail or let somebody out of the system if they were doing trial, and that they automatically, based on a judge's sentence or based on signing up to a reentry program, get skilled. We have to train people with that. Then we have to have them become conducive to a work environment of working around other people, the socializing of that. All of that is a step-by-step process that again starts with what we've agreed with, that everybody's precious enough, so you have to reach people where they start and bring them to where you want to bring them, because they don't have these skills. I grew up with people that did not have job skills, that didn't know how to work in a work environment. So they created a different kind of personality that was out front to try and cover for what they lacked. When we've got to be able to say to them, it's all right you don't have that. It's all right you don't know that. Now let us help teach you that, not in a condescending way, but in a constructive way, because we see you as more valuable than that, and you can do what anybody else can do if you're given the opportunity. It's how we reach it in terms of society understanding it and how we talk to the individual.
So I mean, just having this conversation with Reverend Al and Christie also changes the playing field. I mean, Al, one of the areas that, and we're grateful to do the work we do every day with 11,000 clients in terms of getting them employment and benefits and healthcare. But I just wanted to push a little bit. So we also confront there are guys in the prison system that may have committed, say, for example, felony murder when they were 18, 19, or 20 years of age, and psychologists say that their development is still proceeding. and they receive a sentence 30 years to life. They do
Right.
the 30 years. And in the course of their time, they have no family. During the course of the time, they no longer have a community. Does it ever make sense to look at the idea of a judicial parole as opposed to just parole? So, I mean, to provide some level of review that if Jim McGreevy was, depending on the circumstances, at a crime or at a murder when I was 17 or 18 years of age, tried as an adult, had a 30 to life conviction. I've served 30 years. And in the last years of my life, I've been able to turn it around, but I have nowhere to go to. Does it ever make sense that the courts would review something called rehabilitative release? Rev?
I think that it makes sense. The question is how you get there. I think that it could be a process that would lead toward where we ultimately want to go. And I think that you would need bipartisan support to get there. And again, I've talked and worked with some people in the criminal justice area on the bench, judges and all. I think we could get there if we are determined to do it in a way that has a moral tone and the values of what we supposed to represent. I think we can get there. I think it'd be very helpful.
And Chris, just in terms of closing prisons, and you talked about that, how do we move in that direction? How do we, it's almost as if you have a prison, it's going to be full. If you have a prison, it's going to be, how do we get from where we are to a system that's more community-based in terms of support?
That, you see, it's interesting because it doesn't need to be the case. I mean, think about this, Gov. From the time I became governor to the time I left, our prison population went down over 35%.
Yep.
In the state prison system, which is what permitted us to close 2 prisons. I would argue this to you, that running those prisons, if you don't need to, is one of the most non-productive expenditures of money we do in state government. And quite frankly, that's a high bar, right? I mean,
Yep.
We spend a lot of non-productive money in government, in my opinion. And so, the way you talk about it is, I think, exactly what Reverend Al just said. It is got to be not just a fiscal issue. It's not going to be just a crime issue. It's got to be a fiscal issue, a crime prevention issue, and a moral issue. I really believe that we don't speak enough about morality in this context. And to me, that's what brings people together. I can't tell you how many times I will sit in church, and in the next pew over, for instance, I went to church. Mary Pat and I went to church last Sunday at the St. John's Cathedral in Patterson, and we sat in that church, and there are people in there who probably never voted for me, and are certainly well to the progressive side of where I would be philosophically. But we stood up and made our profession of faith together. It is those moral issues, as in my instance as a Catholic, that brings us together. And so we forget sometimes in politics, and sometimes we're reluctant because, people misunderstand the constitutional provision of a separation of church and state, with there being no role for religion and morality when we talk about how we govern ourselves as a society. I know Reverend Al disagrees with this because of where he comes from. There's got to be a way to bring it in, and that's what touches people's hearts, Jim. And if you really want to move people, you can't just appeal to their brains, you have to touch their hearts. And so to me, on the issue of prison closings, it's about, why would we want to pay for all that? And think about when we closed the state prison at Fort Dix, we didn't close it. We refurbished it.
Repurposed it.
Facility for drug treatment of prisoners when they're in their final year of their sentence. Well, my God, if people don't believe that's a much better use than the warehousing of people,
Yep.
then you haven't touched their hearts. And that's
you're so right, Governor. And Craig Haney is going to come on after this panel, and he was part of the Stanford prison experiment back years ago, where they literally took ordinary people, made certain people correction officers, made certain people guards, made certain people prison, and how people reacted. And Craig's going to share that, but I think you just touched a really important chord. And I remember the quote in high school that Lincoln said, Harry Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin did more to end slavery than any other single factor, because people understood we're ripping apart families, and it was the emotional, ethical, moral response. And so to Rev, we talk about we talk about prison reform, criminal justice reform, the strong advent of Black Lives Matter, and the fact that reentry is the tail end of that criminal justice pipeline. So when we hear from Governor Christie and we hear from you as to the possibilities of a moral change and legislative change, how do we the way this country has embarked upon so many national changes? I mean, what I guess, and thanks to the governor's leadership and so many others, we've made some real significant substantive changes in New Jersey. But how do we make this as American as apple pie? The notion of second chances, the notion of providing people with work opportunities. What you said is calling for accountability, not only in terms of training, but in job prospect, like in the infrastructure bill that the president is talking about. Can there ever be a set aside for court-involved persons to hire them? I mean, we grapple every day, and the governor knows this. Tom Calcagni would help us out with people trying to get licensed, whether it's a barber, a beautician, whatever it was. There are so many barriers, to go to the governor's point, either in terms of shame or bias or legal. But how do we create this as a national movement so that we change lives? And we just, today is important, really is important, with Reverend Al and Christie talking about material changes and moral change. But how do we make this a national cause?
I think that you have to have policy and legislation to do it, but I think it has to be driven as a moral movement. I grew up in the North, but I was mentored by people from the South of Dr. King's movement. And one of the things that Mrs. King used to be very hard on us about is that she said, I understand you don't come out of the South, Al, and that you come out of the hard edge, way you talk in northern urban streets. But if you do not have a moral movement, you cannot pass the laws you want, because it will be too politically expensive for those that you want to do that, which is really what I thought about when Governor Christie was talking about. You got to change people's hearts. People will operate based on what they believe. The magic of the King movement, there were other movements out there that were more abrasive. They were right, but their style was more abrasive and more, let's say, pointed than Dr. King's was. But King's way of preaching this moral, righteous kind of thing, the same thing that you referred to when you talked about Harriet Beecher Stowe, the difference between a Frederick Douglass and others then, is that they were all after the same thing, but the approach was different, because people want to feel that they are good. People want to feel they're doing things right, not that they are just bad. So it's one way to come and say, you guys are bums and you're doing so and so and so. Or another way to saying that that we as a people, as the people in this country, we as Americans, believe that every child born is a child that God decided to bring in this world as a value. We're better than that. That's a different approach. And it's going to the same place. And I think that we've got to fine-tune an approach that people from different parts of the political spectrum can say together, we're better than throwing away people. Some people have thrown themselves away, but we're not going to throw anybody away that wants to be redeemed. Now, if you want to throw yourself away, we will accommodate that. But we are not going to deal with those that sincerely prove that they want to be a redeemed individual. Now we're gonna give you steps to show that you prove that, because we're not gonna have grandma as your prey. But those steps are gonna be toward really because we believe in salvaging you. We just want to believe that you're there to salvage yourself, or that you may have gotten a bad break. You might have been the one that the system messed up and you shouldn't have been incarcerated. So therefore, it should be easier for you to prove you're not a bad person because you claim you were never that in the first place. You're a casualty. So you ought to be the easiest one for us to be able to bring through these steps.
Hey, man, that was Chris. As we wrap up, I mean, I'm just so grateful on so many levels for what you've done for our guys, and starting in, one center, and now we've got 9 centers and 11,000 people and changing lives. And to go to what Reverend Al said, it was always for us a moral, if not a religious calling at ministry. And it's been your vision. Just as, I hear you and Reverend Al, and I think, my God, this is such a conversation of possibilities, and, to close prisons, because my fear is if you don't close prisons, we get too comfortable with what is, and to move and to change those resources and to reclaim lives. Just as Reverend Al said on this time of Good Friday and Easter, reentry, and what are your hopes, both in New Jersey but also nationally, for this movement that we're trying to create?
Well, first of all, Gov, I think because of the work that you helped to inspire in the state, because of your work, we're on a very good path in New Jersey, and I hope and pray that the Governor Murphy continues to build on that work, and to make it something that can be a national model, because it is one already. My hope for what we do nationally is, we are a very divided country right now in so many ways, and our leaders' obligation today, I think, is because of the things that have happened over the last decade or two. The leadership for the next number of years has to look for ways to bring our country together on common ground. It's not going to be forcing people to places. When we try to do that, it doesn't work. When government grabs people and drags them to a spot, they're not going to stay in that spot. They're going to move back to their spot that's comfortable. What we need to do, and what I think this issue provides us an incredible opportunity to do, is for government to go to where people's hearts are already. And so I don't care what neighborhood you're talking about in this country. There are people who, in every one of those neighborhoods, who understand the ravages of addiction and that it is a disease. The people are much further ahead of government on this, that this is a disease that needs to be treated. They understand that those people who suffer from that disease need help and need support. And they understand that just putting them away in a warehouse is not going to change the underlying problem that they're living with and confronting every day. And so those are areas of common ground for our country. Let's be talking that way. And I think for people in my party, sometimes they're afraid to speak that way because they think, as Reverend Al talked about before in a different context, it makes them sound soft. Well, hell, man, I'm from New Jersey. No one's ever going to accuse me of being soft. But we've got to allow ourselves to speak in a way that will appeal to everyone beyond politics. And the way you do that is every person we're trying to talk to out there, at least almost every person, is a mother or a father, is a sister or a brother, and every person out there has been a son or a daughter. And we need to appeal to them on that basis, Gov. And we need to look at them and say, what would you want if this was your son? What would you want if this was your daughter? What would you want if this was your brother or sister? You wouldn't want to give up on them, and you wouldn't want anybody else to give up on them. Well, what our faith teaches us is that every person I sat in that cathedral with last Sunday in Paterson, New Jersey, is my brother and sister. And that's the way we've got to start thinking in this country. And we can make it a national movement if national leaders are willing to stop worrying about what the first focus group they do will think of this, but what that family, will think about it. I'll give you one final example. I was just thinking about this the other day. When I was governor, Whitney Houston passed away from her drug addiction. And now this was an extraordinarily accomplished, talented, proud woman who brought great pride to our state. She was a Jersey girl in every way.
You ordered the flags.
Yes, and I ordered the flags at half staff. And I cannot tell you the ugly, hateful emails and letters I got thereafter because people were judging her addiction, her disease. And I stood up and said, I'm not going to stand for this. And she is a daughter of New Jersey. She's an incredibly accomplished person who brought great pride to our state. And we need to stand up and say that she is a victim of the disease that she could not conquer. Well, when you start talking about it that way, it's a different thing. And we need to be thinking about not just the Whitney Houstons, but all the other people who don't have some of the God-given abilities that she had and don't achieve the fame that she achieved, but we have to treat them in the very same way. And who in America wants to disagree with that?
Amen. Amen. That's powerful. And I just want you to know part of your legacy is in New Jersey Reentry. Within 24 hours, and we have a number, within 24 hours, we'll get somebody in detox, residential treatment, IOP, or MAT. Within 24 hours, that's the commitment we've made to our board of directors, to both of you, and to our state. So thank you for sharing that. And the story about Whitney Houston was particularly poignant. Thank you. And to Reverend Al, your thoughts about how we move this forward on a national.
I think that we begin by conversations like this and by commitments to go out and change the conversation and raise it to a moral level. Governor Christie and I have not agreed on everything, and we won't in the future, but we agree on this. And I think that we all have to have the courage to do that. And I might say, in the height of us attacking Governor Christie on other issues, he did stand up with Whitney Houston. He not only had the flags at half staff, he came to her funeral. I remember, I sat right behind him in the choir stand. And I think that we must learn we can disagree without being disagreeable. And where we can find common ground, we need to do that. I remember, and I'll end with this, I remember Governor McGreevey, I was leading a march in Bensonhurst against a racial killing of a young man named Yusuf Hawkins in 1989. And a guy, white fella, jumped out the crowd and stabbed him. And I went to court about 6 months later. He was on trial. And I asked the judge to give him leniency. The judge said, that's a noble thing to do, Reverend, but it's felony assault. He gave him 9 years in jail. I visited him in jail. And the guy said to me, I don't know why you're doing this. I tried to kill you. Take your father away from your daughters. He says, I grew up an alcoholic. I would have been a big guy if I killed Al Sharpton. And you have given me more forgiveness and understanding than anybody I know. I said, you got to understand something. His name was Michael Riccardi. I said, I didn't do this for you. I did this for me. Because if I'm going to be about what I said I'm about in the tradition of King, I had to do this. I did not want to do this. It takes a lot for me to even walk in here and look at a guy that tried to kill me. But I've got to do it for me. And what I'm saying to people as we have this conversation with Governor Christie is not about deferring to a Christie or him deferring to an Al Sharpton. It's who are you? Stand up and do it to stand up and be the good person, moral person you claim to be. And it doesn't matter who's with you. It matters if you are interpreting who you are for you.
This is great. I just want to say thank you to Governor Christie. I want to say thank you to Reverend Sharpton. It's not only talking about the common ground, but it's also recreating or revisioning reentry as a moral cause, to use your language, Chris, and to use and to Reverend Al, your point is it's about us individually, who we are as a people, who we are as Americans, who we are as people of faith. So I just humbly want to say thank you to Governor Christie for all of his support. I want to say thank you to Reverend Al for his daily support, the feeding, and just you both here today speaks, I think, largely to America and to all those in prison, to all those struggling, that there are people on the national level that believe in your dignity, your worth, and the hope of a second chance. So to each of you, thank you very much, my friends.
Thank
God
you.
bless
Thank
and
you.
happy Easter.
Same to you.
Good to see you, Al.
Good to see you. Happy Easter to you and your family. Thank you for the work you do, Governor McGreevy. We with you.
Amen.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Rev. Well, those are two incredible individuals, and I'm so grateful for everything they do.